Okay, so Craig and Bradley Wilcox are two brothers. One's a physician and one's a pharmacist. I forget which one is which, but they're people that studied the Okinawan people, the Okinawan diet. They wrote a book called the Okinawan Protocol, and this book shows you how to live your life according to the lifestyle of the Okinawans. And why is that important? Well, it's important because the Okinawans tend to live very long compared to the average population in the world, and that's why it's important. So let's take a look at what the Wilcox brothers say. Well, this is actually just Craig Wilcox here, but he says residents of Okinawa, the southernmost prefecture of Japan, are known for their long average life expectancy, high numbers of centenarians, and accompanying low risk of age-associated diseases. Much of the longevity advantage in Okinawa is thought to be related to a healthy lifestyle, particularly the traditional diet, which is low in calories yet nutritionally dense, especially with regard to phytonutrients in the form of antioxidants and flavonoids. Okay, research suggests that diets associated with a reduced risk of chronic diseases are similar to the traditional Okinawan diet, that is, vegetable and fruit heavy, therefore phytonutrient and antioxidant rich, but reduced in meat, refined grains, saturated fat, sugar, salt, and full-fat dairy products. Many of the characteristics of the diet in Okinawa are shared with other healthy dietary patterns, such as the traditional Mediterranean diet or the modern DASH diet. Features such as low levels of saturated fat, high antioxidant intake, and low glycemic load in these diets are likely contributing to decreased risk of cardiovascular disease, some cancers, and other chronic diseases through multiple mechanisms, including reduced oxidative stress. A comparison of the nutrient profiles of the three dietary patterns shows that the traditional Okinawan diet is the lowest in fat intake, particularly in terms of saturated fat, and highest in carbohydrate intake, in keeping with the very high intake of antioxidant-rich yet calorie-poor, meaning they're high in nutrients, especially antioxidants, and low in calories. Orange and yellow root vegetables such as sweet potatoes and green leafy vegetables. Deeper analysis of the individual components of the Okinawan diet reveal that many of the traditional foods, herbs, or spices consumed on a regular basis could be labeled as functional foods, and indeed are currently being explored for their potential health-enhancing properties. So this is about calorie restriction and calorie restriction mimetics and healthy aging in Okinawa, controversies and clinical implications. So what is a calorie restriction mimetic or mimetic? Well, a calorie restriction mimetic is something that mimics caloric restriction. It activates the same genetic and metabolic pathways as caloric restriction. So what would those be? Well, they would be phytonutrients. They would be things like quercetin. They would be things like resveratrol. Now, before I get started, I want to remind people that I am not a physician. I am not a DO, not an MD, not a chiropractor, not a nurse, not an RN, not an LPN, not a nurse practitioner, nothing like that. Nothing, not a dietitian, not a nutritionist. This is not health advice. This video does not count as health advice. If you want health advice, seek health advice from a licensed healthcare provider in your area. So what I want to point out is so calorie restriction. One of the things that I don't know if it's really, I've never heard of Okinawans eating the rhizomes of it, but there's a plant called Japanese knotweed, which is very rich in trans resveratrol. Now, trans resveratrol, unlike cis resveratrol, is more absorbable. And Japanese knotweed is actually endemic. It's a weed in the United States. It's growing like wildfire all throughout Appalachia and things like that. But it's also extremely health promoting. It's like essentially like free medicine. And the reason it's so health promoting is the high phytonutrient content, particularly the trans resveratrol. It's what most trans resveratrol products are made out of, is Japanese knotweed. So caloric restriction, okay, here we go. So recent findings: caloric restriction is a research priority for the U.S. National Institute on Aging. However, little is known regarding health effects in humans. Some caloric restriction-related outcomes, such as cause-specific mortality and lifespan, are not practical for human clinical trials. Therefore, epidemiological data on older Okinawans who experienced a caloric restriction-like diet for close to half their lives are of special interest. The nutritional data support mild caloric restriction, only 10 to 15%. So mild caloric restriction of 10 to 15%, and high consumption of foods that may mimic the biological effects of caloric restriction, including sweet potatoes, marine-based carotenoid-rich foods, and turmeric. Phenotypic evidence is consistent with caloric restriction, including short stature, low body weight, and lean body mass index. Less age-related chronic disease, including cardiovascular disease, cancer, and dementia, and longer lifespan, both mean and maximum. Summary: both caloric restriction and traditional Okinawan functional foods with caloric restriction mimetic properties likely had roles in the extended lifespans and the extended health span and lifespan of the Okinawans. More research is needed on the health consequences of caloric restriction and foods with caloric restriction mimetic properties to identify possible nutritional interventions for healthy aging. This is about validating that the Okinawan centenarians actually are centenarians, meaning that they're actually 100 years or more. And why is that important? Well, a lot of times people that were claiming to be centenarians were not centenarians. So long-lived individuals such as centenarians may harbor genetic or environmental advantages important for healthy aging populations with high prevalence of such individuals. Offer fertile ground for such research. However, precise phenotypes are required, particularly accurate age. Okinawa has among the world's highest reported prevalence of centenarians, but despite extensive study, no systematic validation of centenarian prevalence has been published. Therefore, we, meaning the Wilcox brothers, performed comprehensive age validation of a subset of 8% of the total centenarian population and assessed the reliability of the age registration system. Self-reported age was validated with several common methods and found to correlate well with documented age demographic methods, including assessment of age, heaping, maximum age at death, centenarian proportions, and male to female ratios of centenarians indicate that the age registration system is reliable. They conclude that the high reported centenarian prevalence in Okinawa is valid and warrants further study for its genetic and environmental correlates. Healthy aging diets other than the Mediterranean diet focus on the Okinawan diet. Why is this? Why are they doing this? Well, the reason why is the Mediterranean diet, okay, which was the based on the research of Dr. Ansel Keys, who was the one that was in charge of our military's nutrition research during World War II. It's important to understand that research is the heart and soul of plant-based dieting, plant-centered eating, of the whole idea of the Mediterranean diet, which is basically an intervention that's used for heart disease patients and to prevent heart disease at this point in time. So it's very important to understand that. So the Mediterranean diet has received a lot of focus because of Ansel Keys' 7-country study. And I'll get into that when I cover Ansel Keys. I'm probably going to cover Ansel Keys after this uploads. It might be tomorrow, though. I had planned on doing it today, but I got sidetracked with baloney. So the traditional diet in Okinawa is anchored by root vegetables, green and yellow vegetables, soybean-based foods, and medicinal plants. Marine foods, lean meats, fruit, medicinal garnishes like pickled ginger and things like that, and spices, tea, alcohol are also moderately consumed. Many characteristics of the traditional Okinawan diet are shared with other healthy dietary patterns, including the traditional Mediterranean diet, DASH diet, and the portfolio diet. All these dietary patterns are associated with reduced risk for cardiovascular disease, among other associated diseases. Overall, the important shared features of these healthy dietary patterns include high intake of unrefined carbohydrates, moderate protein intake, emphasis on vegetables and legumes, fish, and lean meat as sources, and a healthy fat profile, higher in mono and polyunsaturated fats and lower in saturated fat, also rich in omega-3 fatty acids. The healthy fat intake is likely one mechanism for reducing inflammation, optimizing cholesterol, and other risk factors. Additionally, the lower caloric density of plant-rich diets results in lower caloric intake, so you're naturally restricting calories, with concomitant high intake of phytonutrients and antioxidants. Other shared features include low glycemic load, that low glycemic index foods, they should say, because it's, overall high in carbohydrates, less inflammation and oxidative stress, and potential modulation of aging-related biological pathways. This may reduce the risk for chronic disease, chronic age-associated diseases, and promote healthy aging and longevity. Achieving healthy aging, the art of the possible. What can we realistically achieve in terms of healthy human aging? There is ongoing debate that seems to swing between two poles. Some scientists optimistically argue that technological breakthroughs may soon extend the human lifespan to 1,000 or more years. Others argue that we may have already hit the wall in terms of the potential for growth in human life expectancy, and we might even witness declines in the 21st century due to obesity and the reemergence of infectious disease. Caloric restriction is among the most robust interventions in model organisms of aging for extending lifespan. With the plethora of recent studies and of primates, including humans, some argue that dietary interventions such as caloric restriction have the potential to significantly extend human lifespan, as they have in invertebrate and animal models. Although the evidence for dietary restriction effects in primates, including humans, is promising, and there are individuals who follow such a regime, it is not practical as a public health policy. It should be practical as a public health policy, for God's sake. It's not 15% caloric restriction from what people normally eat. Good God. Nor are mechanistic studies of model organisms always applicable to humans, thus caution must be used when extrapolating such findings to human populations. On a more practical level, substantial population health gains may be possible in the future if we can delay the onset of common age-related diseases by currently available risk factor modification. In order to further quantify the potentially achievable population-wide benefits of such an approach, public health scientists estimated that delaying typical age-related morbidity in Americans by just 7 years would decrease the age-specific risk of disability and death by 50%, allowing a substantial improvement in both lifespan and, more importantly, in health span. The authors labeled this the longevity dividend. Combining what we already know about modifying risk factors for chronic disease with a better understanding of the genetics of healthy aging may help optimize future targets for intervention. For example, a review of 50 GWAS, I don't know what that means actually, studies of 4 major aging-related phenotypes found that, I'm assuming they mean a group of people, phenotypes found that cell cycle regrowth and tissue repair were the most common biological pathways across these aging-related phenotypes, and may represent good targets for intervention. Nevertheless, whether one uses pharmacologically active foods or food extracts to target specific aging-related biological pathways or nutritional interventions that target multiple pathways related to aging, it will be important to identify individual genetic susceptibility to particular risk factor interventions. The scientific discipline of epidemiology, which includes genetic epidemiology and nutritional epidemiology, may provide clues as to where to begin and which path to follow. Okay. Is there an ideal dietary pattern for healthy aging? In a discouraging trend, modern societies seem to be converging on a common dietary pattern, one that is not ideal for healthy aging. This is a diet high in saturated fat, sugar, and refined carbohydrates, but low in fiber and phytonutrients, and is often labeled the Western diet. In fact, recent research on the nutrition transition has concluded that the majority of nations in Asia, Latin America, Northern Africa, and urban areas of sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East share remarkably similar dietary disease pattern shifts. Common to this shift is the consumption of more animal products, more fat, and more sugar. Conversely, there have been substantial decreases in cereal. There have been decreases in cereal products and fiber. Different foods drive this dietary westernization in different regions. Now, notice they put westernization in quotes because it's not really westernization. It's not a Western diet, it's a processed diet. Okay, in Asia, as an example, edible oil consumption is a large aspect of the overall increase in dietary fat in the region, regardless of the heterogeneity in particular details of this dietary shift. The overall dietary pattern is low to high caloric energy density so basically people are eating high calorie foods that lack nutrients. The Western diet, the relation between a nutrient poor, energy dense, meaning a diet that is poor, it doesn't have a lot of nutrients, but it's energy dense, meaning it has a lot of calories, combined with a sedentary lifestyle and increased chronic disease risk, has been well established. This dietary pattern is characterized by a high caloric density, a high intake of meat, especially red and processed meats, and accompanying saturated fat, and an unfavorable omega-6 to omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acid ratio, a high intake of refined carbohydrates, and a low intake of fruits, vegetables, fiber, and phytonutrients. This is a common dietary pattern in the United States and many other so-called Western nations. However, it is also a dietary pattern that, as previously mentioned, modernizing societies are adopting. The USDA reports that in general, Americans, this could be extrapolated to all who follow the Western dietary pattern, consume too many calories and too much saturated fat and trans fats, cholesterol, too much sugar, too much salt. They typically lack sufficient dietary fiber, sufficient dietary calcium, sufficient magnesium, sufficient potassium, and the antioxidant vitamins A as carotenoids, C and E. This kind of dietary pattern not only leads to nutritional deficiencies, but also, now remember, I've talked about Bruce Ames and the triage theory of natural selection. So deficiencies in these vitamins not only lead to nutritional deficiencies, but also promote a cluster of metabolic problems. Remember, the triage theory of aging and disease. Okay. Reduced insulin sensitivity, glucose intolerance, dyslipidemia, meaning an imbalance of the lipids, as well as systematic inflammation, all risk factors for the most common age-associated diseases that include cardiovascular disease, particular cancers, type 2 diabetes, among others. As indicated above, dietary pattern analysis may represent a useful addition to the repertoire of researchers who studied the relationship between diet and chronic disease. However, the reality until very recently has been that researchers have focused mainly upon the effects of individual nutrients and sometimes foods, but rarely on dietary patterns on disease risk factors, biomarkers, or morbidity. Prospective nutrition-related cohort studies with all-cause mortality or other aging-related outcomes are not common, since a large cohort must be followed for adequate statistical power, and or duration of follow-up needs to be long for enough events to occur, a component then most studies can ill afford. The DASH diet. This is a diet that was designed to treat high blood pressure. The dietary approach is to stop hypertension. Diet, arguably the most common physician-prescribed diet to fight high blood pressure, and was, in fact, originally developed by the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute to do just that. Therefore, the acronym, the DASH diet, The DASH dietary pattern is rich in fruits and vegetables, whole grains, low-fat dairy products, fish, poultry, beans, nuts, and seeds. It also contains less sodium, sugar, fats, and red meat than the usual Western diet as described above, designed with cardiovascular health in mind. The DASH diet is also lower in saturated and trans fats and cholesterol, and rich in nutrients such as potassium, magnesium, calcium, protein, and fiber that are helpful for lowering blood pressure. Research on the DASH dietary pattern has shown that it not only can lower blood pressure but also improve other risk factors for cardiovascular disease such as HDL cholesterol levels, triglycerides, or blood sugar. Long-term studies of the DASH dietary pattern have been associated with lower risk for hypertension and other cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, and several types of cancer. The portfolio diet, as briefly discussed earlier, in an attempt to increase the effectiveness of diet in reducing serum cholesterol, the National Cholesterol Education Program and American Heart Association recently recommended the use of functional foods or foods high in components that reduce cholesterol as options and dietary strategies. With these recommendations in mind, the portfolio diet was designed by the University of Toronto researchers to test the effectiveness of this diet approach against standard drug therapy statins. Plant foods are emphasized in this vegetarian dietary pattern, rich in vegetables such as broccoli, eggplant, tomatoes, onions, okra. Whole grains are plentiful, including oats and barley, and other prominent foods include vegetable-based margarine, almonds, and soy protein. The study found that when these phytonutrient-rich foods were mixed into an already healthy diet, LDL cholesterol was reduced by 30%. This finding suggests that a combination of LDL-lowering dietary strategies has additive effects when added to healthy diet and can produce clinically significant reductions in cardiovascular heart disease risk. A number of other benefits such as lower inflammation, lower C-reactive protein, blood levels, and weight loss were also witnessed. Viscous fibers facilitate bile acid loss from the gut. Plant sterols reduce cholesterol absorption from the gut. Soy proteins reduce hepatic cholesterol synthesis and may increase the hepatic LDL receptor uptake of cholesterol. Almonds, which contain monounsaturated fat, plant sterols, plant protein and fiber, and other phytochemicals, operate through a variety of mechanisms to reduce LDL. There was a clear advantage for the portfolio diet for cholesterol reduction versus a comparison vegetarian low saturated fat diet without these four functional foods. So remember that adding almonds, soy protein, fiber, like from oats and whatnot. Oh no, that would actually be fiber from like vegetables. Okay, is variety the spice of life and health? Is consuming a variety of different foods important for health? The Japanese certainly believe this is true. A common lesson for children illustrated in a popular children's book is to bring a daily lunch bento with something from, who cares? Okay. The key upon further analysis is that these nutrient-dense diets are anchored by high-quality foods despite a range in macronutrients. Both diets are dominated by low glycemic carbohydrates, lean proteins, much of it from plant sources, and healthy fats, monounsaturated omega-3 and omega-3 fats, which is associated with reduced risk of chronic age-associated diseases. A diet portfolio rich in fruits and vegetables, legumes, and whole grains, but reduced in animal products and accompanying saturated fat, salt, sweets, and refined carbohydrates may be the most prudent to recommend for healthy aging. Adding in a dash of Okinawan herbs and spices may also help keep sodium levels in check while boosting one's antioxidant and anti-inflammatory network capacity. The Okinawan diet, much of the longevity advantage in Okinawa, is thought to be related to healthy lifestyle. This includes the traditional diet, which is low in calories yet nutritionally dense, particularly with regards to vitamins, minerals, and phytonutrients, several of which have nutraceutical potential. Haute cuisine, Okinawan style. Many wonder how the Okinawan traditional diet pattern differs from the Japanese. The Okinawan diet is Japanese with salsa due to the influence of other Asian cuisines with a tendency towards spicier dishes, although many similarities exist, including the high intake of vegetables and soy products, the low fat content, the taste for miso, plentiful fish and sea vegetables, and the lack of dairy products. The traditional Okinawan diet differs dramatically in some key areas. Example, the staple of the Okinawan diet is the ubiquitous sweet potato, not rice. Okay, over half of the daily caloric intake was from these colorful, sweet-tasting tuberous roots from the morning glory family. Other key areas of difference include the Okinawan taste for flavoring such as dashi or bonito, which are fish-based broths, and the routine use of herbs and spices in place of salt in Okinawan Haute cuisine. Traditional Okinawan cuisine centers on the staple sweet potato, green leafy or yellow root vegetables, and soy. Miso soup, tofu, and other incarnations of this legume, which accompanied almost every meal. Okay, this is what the Okinawan diet food pyramid looks like. Let's see, can I bring that up? Yep, there we go. So what you're eating is based in vegetables and fruits, followed by legumes, low glycemic grains, fish and lean meats, oils, condiments, herbs and spices, and sweets in very top, almost non-existent, alcohol in moderation, daily daily jasmine tea, daily physical activity. A meal would typically begin with an Okinawan-style miso soup. Unlike the Japanese version, Okinawans preferred to garnish their miso soup with small amounts of tofu, fish, pork, or vegetables. There are 3 main cooking styles. Okay. Almost vegetarians. As can be seen from the above descriptions of the typical meal, the Okinawans of old were not vegetarians, but they were close to this eating pattern, but not by any particular conscious choice. Like most Asian populations in the first half of the 20th century, the average family simply could not afford meat, nor processed foods such as sugar, salt, cooking oil, or in the case of Okinawa, imported polished rice. Staple foods were what could grow locally. Since Okinawa consists of a string of subtropical islands with seasonal, quite severe thunderstorms, they had 2 growing seasons, which favored fresh plant foods. Some vegetables grew very well, but rice did not. In fact, rice was supplanted in the 1600s by the sweet potato as the main staple. When it was first imported from China, the sweet potato is hardy and can survive severe climates, and thus became the main calorie source. Most other plant foods were also grown and consumed locally. Okay. As a person that has personally tried a relatively restricted protein diet and has tried a high protein diet and has tried these diets as omnivorous, vegetarian, pescatarian, and vegan, I would like to point out that I think that the best diet is a higher protein diet, regardless of whether it's omnivorous, regardless of whether it's pescatarian, regardless of whether it's vegetarian. And I think those protein sources, obviously you should be focusing on plant-based protein, such as from lentils and things of that nature. But let's see what this says about dietary protein and aging. Now, I started restricting protein because one of my friends that was a gerontologist was crazy about John McDougall and the starch solution. And let's just say I tried the starch solution. It didn't work well for me. The low protein, low fat it just didn't work. I needed to add back in a high amount of fat. I needed to add back in a high amount of protein. And I needed to focus on high fiber sources of carbohydrate. So caloric restriction is a major nutritional intervention that historically has been shown to influence lifespan and or health span. In many animal studies have suggested that the reduction in protein intake can also increase lifespan, albeit not as dramatically as caloric restriction. Well, if it's not working as dramatically as caloric restriction, why don't you know, I'm gonna restrict my calories a little bit to get the more dramatic effect without the freaking crazy health effects I got from restricting protein. Okay, I got a really deleterious effect on my health. More recent research based on nutritional geometry has attempted to define the effects of nutrition on aging, blah, blah, blah. Established dietary mantra. The longest living people are the residents of the Japanese island of Okinawa, who have as many as 5 times more centenarians than other developed nations. There are many factors that contribute to their exceptional longevity, including mild caloric restriction, food quality, genes. Genes, I don't think that's the case, because if you look at Okinawans in other parts of the world, if they're in Brazil or whatever, when they start eating the local diets, they start getting sick like the local people. The energy from their diets was derived from 9% protein and 85% carbohydrate. And like I said, what you have to notice, what kind of carbohydrate? High fiber sweet potatoes, high fiber sea vegetables, high fiber green leafy vegetables. So what I would like to point out, when people say that they eat 85% of their, you have to remember, fiber is a carbohydrate, but it doesn't affect the blood sugar. It actually stabilizes the blood sugar. So you have to subtract the fiber from the total carbohydrate if you're counting carbohydrates. You can't go by total carbohydrate. So what I would like to point out, which is a flaw in this study, is that high fiber is not the same as saying high carbohydrate. The Okinawans follow a very high fiber diet. Okay, so I'm going to move on. This is about the increase of the caloric. Okay, in most caloric restriction studies, access to food is reduced. The increase in maximum and or median lifespan with caloric restriction has been reported across different animals, okay, different taxa, from yeast to worms to flies to mice to rats and dogs, with health and or lifespan benefits reported in primates, including humans, which is why mild caloric restriction, I think, is a much better idea. Where is it? Older people, caloric restriction, protein restriction. Okay, wait. Where did I see that again? Okay. More research. Who cares? The point is mild caloric restriction, as was covered earlier. See, that's the thing, is you need protein to drive anabolic responses. You need to retain muscle mass. You don't want to suffer from sarcopenia, and people don't grasp this. And that's one of the problems that I think is a mistake with a lot of the modern gerontologists, is they're not understanding the importance of muscle. And I'm going to go over that with muscle's importance to the endocrine system in a later video, but not this video, because there's a reason I supplement with branched chain amino acids while everybody else is saying don't take branched chain amino acids. But I'm going to move on to some interviews with the Wilcox brothers.